In this lecture, we are going to be going over researching and discussing the causes of complex problems. So this slideshow and lecture go over quite a bit of information. I will try and get through it in a timely manner, but try and stick with me. If you need to take a break, pause it and come back. But it's definitely super useful stuff as you get started on researching and discussing a complex problem for your upcoming essay. All right, so part 1, how do we discuss complex problems? So the first thing that you need to remember when you're talking about a complicated problem is to situate what you say in relation to what others say. So remember that we've been talking about entering an academic conversation, right? And that means that you are paying attention to what other people have to say about a topic before you start to include your own opinion. So in some way, you're responding to something that someone else has said. And it doesn't always have to be direct, but this is a good way to show your reader that, yes, I understand, kind of the big picture things that people have to say about this topic that we're discussing. For you guys right now, that means that you are looking at what other people have to say about why a problem exists, and you're situating kind of what you have to say in relation to that. So you might agree with them, you might disagree, you might have a little bit of both, okay? So this is an excerpt from one of our books, They Say, I Say. And I highlighted this part because it's an important quote from the text. So you shouldn't keep readers in suspense too long about your central argument. And you do need to present that argument as part of some larger conversation, indicating something about the arguments of others that you are supporting, opposing, amending, complicating, or qualifying. So remember that you do need to use the skills that we have already learned about summary. So use those as you sum up what other people are saying, but also make sure that you're giving equal weight and attention to what you are saying about the subject, right? Make sure that you check out our 3-minute guide to summary lecture that's on my YouTube channel if you are not familiar or if you just want a really quick refresher on how to summarize. So in this part of our unit and in your upcoming essay, we're practicing discussing complexity. So when we're talking about an ongoing problem, and for our purposes, we're looking at all of the factors that contribute to that problem, it's important to look at lots of opinions about what is causing this thing to happen. So complex problems also often have countless different factors which contribute to the problem. Different people have different opinions about how much each factor contributes to the overall problem. So we can take one example, and that is plastic pollution in the ocean. And if I asked you to think about all of the ways that plastic gets into our oceans, you might see some different reasons, and you might bring those up, right? Whereas when I think about all of the ways that plastic gets into our oceans, all of these things are what I think of, right? Each of these contributes to the problem. So if I were to discuss the complexity of this particular problem, I would say that pollution at the beach, people leave behind their plastic cutlery, containers, etc., is one factor. And then commercial use of all of these things, like every time we have takeout, we get takeout in a bunch of different plastic containers, right? That's another factor that contributes to it. Households choosing to use plastic, like single-use straws or plastic, plates or whatever, and then throwing them away, is another contributing factor, in my opinion, right? So most people can agree that all of these things do, in fact, contribute to this problem. Where we see things get a little bit tricky is when you have to explain, which one contributes more and what do I think, right? So whereas one person might say microplastics that we see in cosmetics, for example, are one really big factor. Maybe you disagree and you feel like plastics from commercial fishing gear are actually a bigger problem. So that's all part of discussing the complexity, right? You might see an author or even an expert who says, this right here is one of the main factors. And you can agree or disagree or both. So you might say, well, I agree that this is part of the problem. For me, the fact that so many plastics come from commercial fishing gear and there's so much more of it makes me feel like this is actually a bigger contributing factor. So in this essay, you're not just listing all of the problems, all of those contributing factors, right? Instead, you're kind of summarizing them, telling us what some people think about different ones, and then also telling us what you think about which ones are the most important. So as you're doing that, it's important to give each cause its own space. So as you're discussing various causes for the problem that you're looking at, make sure to give each one its own paragraph. And you want to develop paragraphs about each factor that contributes to that overall problem. Make sure that you're always situating what you say within the overall conversation. And use the quote sandwich method, which if you have had a class with me before, you're already familiar with. If not, I do have links at the end of this presentation, and I'll share a copy of this presentation with you guys so you can access those. And then always remember to cite, even if you are paraphrasing. So you might be summing up some information in your own words, or if you're using a direct quote. In either case, you have to use this quote sandwich method and cite in MLA. So here's an example of discussing a cause. One cause of plastic pollution in oceans is the tendency for everyone to accept and use single-use plastics. When we order takeout or have a barbecue, it's completely normal to use plastic forks, foam plates, and to have single-use takeout containers. The authors of Ocean Plastic Crisis explain that producers and manufacturers can no longer focus only on low-cost packaged plastic products. And then I've got my MLA citation here. As the authors correctly point out, one key reason why so much plastic ends up in the ocean is that manufacturers and consumers are too focused on cheap single-use plastics. Because there's a demand for the products, manufacturers deliver them. But this is a huge problem for our oceans, since many of those single-use products become litter, which find its way into streams, rivers, and eventually the world's oceans. All right, so let's look at this example a little bit more clearly. So the first thing that you want to do in a paragraph when you're discussing a cause is to make a claim and name that cause that you're discussing, right? So if this is in my essay, this is one of my body paragraphs, it's going to be very clear to my reader that I think that one cause of plastic pollution is single-use plastics, right? And then you might need to say a little bit more about it here, kind of give an example or something like that. That's a good idea. After you've done that, then you need to back this up with some evidence, right? So we're always going back to that quote sandwich method where I'm going to make a claim, introduce and use some evidence, and then follow that up with more of my own talking. So now that I've made that claim, I'm ready to use some evidence. So you should introduce the source that you're using here, include the article title if this is your first time using it, and use a signal phrase. So remember that a signal phrase has a verb, right? So the authors explain. And since this is my first time using this article, I'm going to include the title. So the authors explain, and then that leads directly into my quote. And notice that my quote is nice and short, okay? So a short quote or paraphrase from the text. If you're summing something up in your own words, you still need to do all of this other stuff that comes outside of the quote. So you still need to introduce it, you still need to use a signal phrase, and you do still need to cite an MLA. So keep that in mind. And remember that your quote should directly support the claim that you made in the topic sentence. So the quote says that producers and manufacturers can no longer focus on low-cost packaged plastic products. And my claim is that single-use plastics, such as these things, right, are the problem. So these match up pretty well. After that, you've got your citation in MLA. Remember, that is what we are using. And that is just a last name and a page number. In this case, we see Phelan et al. Because there were like 6 authors for this particular article. So instead of listing all of those, you just do the first author and others. And then this is an important part of these paragraphs for this particular purpose, right? So you can see this part in blue says, as the authors correctly point out. So that lets my reader know that I'm situating my opinion within the opinions of the author, right? So this will tell my reader whether I agree or disagree or both. But notice that I'm not using that first person language, right? I'm not saying I agree or I disagree. I'm just saying that the authors are correct. And then I'm kind of restating and emphasizing and clarifying what it is that they're correct about, which is all of this down here. So make sure you give yourself lots of time and space to restate and further explain how your quote or paraphrase supports the claim that you made up here. So if you think about building paragraphs in this way, hopefully they become less intimidating, and then you can go from having kind of a general outline like this to having very clear and direct and focused paragraphs about each one of these main ideas that you have, okay? All right. The next thing that you should do, or an important thing to do at some point during your writing process, because everybody does it differently, is to make sure that you are making connections between each of the causes that you want to discuss. So once I have an outline like this one, then one of the ways that I can kind of start to organize my thoughts is to make sure that each of my main ideas is related to the other main ideas in some way, right? And they didn't just happen to come out of my head, nicely organized like this. I had to do a lot of moving around when I was thinking, okay, how do I want to say that these are connected to each other? And keep in mind that everyone will see that differently, right? So you don't have to see it the same way as somebody else. And there are lots of different ways that you could draw these arrows. So the way that I drew them kind of goes from here to here to here, right? Because plastics from commercial fishing gear, I might have a paragraph about that one. And then I would say another way that, big companies are responsible for plastic pollution is because commercial businesses, big businesses, use straws, cutlery, plastic takeout containers, etc., instead of maybe biodegradable options or something like that. And then I would go on to talk about how kind of big manufacturers, such as, the people who make cosmetics, are also responsible for that. So I can make a connection between each of my main ideas, which means that there will be a clear connection between each of my paragraphs. But again, you could go any number of different ways with this. So make sure that your paragraphs have some connection that makes sense to you. All right, so quick recap. Discussing a complex problem. Number 1, make sure you're including your opinion about how much of an impact each cause has on the overall problem. but always remember to situate that opinion within what others have to say as well. 2, make sure you're addressing lots of different factors that contribute to the problem that you're looking at. 3, give each factor its own space, which in this case means its own paragraph, and then make connections between each paragraph. All right, so that brings us to part number 2, which is I've got to do all of these research, type things about this problem. How do I research something that's complex? And we're going to talk about it. So the first thing to think about is that in order to research a complex problem, you do need to be familiar with summary, right? So we need to be able to summarize what each person that we find has to say about kind of what causes these problems. So in this case, you're going to be looking at all of those different factors, and I want you to focus on what's causing the problem in the opinions of others and in your own opinion, right? So remember that we're including both of those here. Because in the past, when we've done summaries, your opinion has not been included. So now we're kind of taking it a step further. And in addition to summarizing, we're also talking about what you think in relation to what the authors think. So first, where do we find research? For many of the essays in our class, you should start with the library databases. Remember to use what you've learned about the CRAP test to evaluate the credibility of your sources. For extra help with that and how to examine a source for credibility, check out this lecture on my YouTube channel. Remember to annotate your assignment, and in this case, that is the essay prompt, right? So you're always going to have an essay prompt or an assignment that tells you specifically what you're doing, how many sources you need, and so on. So remember to annotate your assignment so you have that information there and ready as you're doing your research. For extra help with how to annotate, check out this lecture on my YouTube channel, The Quick Guide to Annotating. So let's start with what is a database. Library databases are just online collections of resources, and they can include all kinds of different resources. So they have newspapers, magazines, book reviews, editorials, all kinds of stuff, journal articles and ebooks. Remember that not all of these are scholarly. So just because you found it on a database does not mean that it's a scholarly source and you can use it in your essay. So that's why it's so important for you to be able to use the CRAP test and advanced search options, which we'll talk about later, to make sure you've got the right kind of source for your needs. So lots of students are like, why do I have to use a database instead of just Googling this topic, right? Google, Wikipedia, etc. Those are great places to start finding basic information so that you can get a handle on the subject at hand and find some good key terms to use, get familiar with your subject. But usually you can't cite those things in your essays, or you can't cite the kinds of articles that you'll find there in your essays. But it is a good place to start. Similarly, Google Scholar and other online databases can be a good place to start, but you'll often run into, when you go to read an article from one of those databases, it will ask you for a fee, right, to access the actual article. So if you want to say download a PDF, it'll say, sure, but first you have to give me $60. And we don't want to do that because these articles can be expensive. Whereas if you use your school's library database, your library is paying subscription fees so that you can access those resources without having to pay directly out of your pocket. So once you've got a basic understanding of the subject, that's when it's time to look at those databases so that you can gather sources that you can cite in your writing. So these are a couple of the screens that you will see as you work your way towards accessing the library databases at Fresno State. So if you start from Google, you're just going to put in Henry Madden Library Research. Click on that research button. That's what pops up. And once you do that, you'll see a page that has this in the top left corner. So then you're going to click on research here. And then under, well, there's several different things, but under research tools, you can go over here and click articles, and that will take you to OneSearch, okay? But there's also guides and tutorials, and they're really great. We have a very fabulous librarian who makes lots of great stuff that is super specific and will be very helpful as you try to navigate these databases. So definitely check those things out. So once you've clicked on research and then articles, that's how you get to OneSearch. And this is a great place to start your research. So you can type your keywords here. Like if I were talking about ocean pollution, I would type in plastic in the ocean or plastic ocean pollution and so on. And then use some advanced options to find scholarly articles. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So get familiar with these kind of websites here or pages within the library's websites. You'll need to use those throughout the semester. So we're going to go over some basic tips and how to do all of these things here. So we want to make sure that we're signed into our school account. We want to find the right database, get help from a librarian, use different keywords and combinations, use advanced search options, read abstracts, and then use some critical reading strategies like skimming the article. And then it's also important to make sure that you know how to download a full text PDF and cite an MLA. So we will very briefly go over each of those. So the first step is to make sure that you sign in. You can access library databases from home, but you do have to sign in order to access the articles. So at some point when you are navigating through here, it will ask you to sign in. Your login information is the same as your school email and Canvas username and password. If you are stuck and you need help signing in, you can go to this website here. There are also links to these and more help under our syllabus where it says help. And then you can also give them a call, so 278-5000, and that'll get you talking to somebody also. So once you've logged into the databases, you need to choose a database and also be willing to get help if you get stuck or confused. Library databases can be a little bit overwhelming. So if you're just not sure where to start or something isn't looking right, ask a librarian. A lot of the time there's a chat option right there within the databases, and it will say, do you want to chat with a librarian? They're so useful and helpful and friendly. Ask a librarian if you get stuck. Remember that tutoring is required for our class, so using the databases is a great thing to talk about with a tutor and have them help you out. You can also ask me during my office hours, during class, or you can make an appointment. For broad searches, so where do I start? For broad searches, I'm going to recommend EBSCO. So that's Academic Search Premier. And that's a really good place to start just for general searches about basically anything. For specific searches, so later when we are discussing literature in some of my classes, you might want to use JustStore. That's a good one. You can also look at databases by subject. So let's say you're working in the medical field or social science or biology or whatever. There are databases that are specific for all of those things. And you can just go to databases by subject, click on them, and kind of browse through. So lots of different options. It can be overwhelming. Remember to ask for help. So once you've chosen a database, let's say I'm on EBSCOhost, then it's important to start using keywords and the advanced search option. Keywords are just words or phrases that are going to help you find articles about your subject. And you shouldn't be afraid to try lots of different keywords, lots of different combinations, if you're not finding what you're looking for right away. Research is very much a process, so you want to make sure that you're trying lots of different things until you start getting the types of articles that you're looking for, and then you know, okay, well, this keyword worked a little bit better than that one, and you kind of tend to narrow it down. So, for example, if I'm looking for the causes of ocean pollution, I might use all of these, right? And not all at once, but one at a time. So, first, I might type in ocean pollution, and then I would go back and type in plastic pollution, and then causes of pollution, and so on. And for each of these searches, maybe I'll find one article that I like or that looks promising. And then once I have all the articles that I need, then I don't have to keep going. But don't be afraid to try a bunch of different searches. Another way to help get the kinds of articles that you need is to use advanced search options. So these look different for each database, but generally they do have some things in common. So you can search with keywords and you can click a button that will make it to where you are only seeing journal articles, for instance, or ebooks if you would rather have a book or something like that. You can also exclude things. So you can say, I want to find these keywords, right? And I want it to be journal articles only, but I want to exclude book reviews, for instance, because we can't use book reviews in our writing for our class, right? So you can exclude different things. You can also, before you ever search, click a button to make sure that the full text is available. That's another good one to use. Because sometimes it'll just give you a preview and you can see an abstract, which is kind of a summary of the article, but you can't get the full article. And then that's a bummer once you see it and you're like, oh, this looks great, but I don't have access to it. So clicking the full text and the scholarly or peer-reviewed button are great ways to start. Another couple things that are really important when you're using research databases and trying to find scholarly journal articles that you can use are a couple of things called skimming and then reading the abstract. So first we want to skim the article. Look at the author and the title of your source to make sure it's definitely scholarly. So this is where the CRAP test is going to come in. If you don't see an author, it's probably not scholarly, so not worth your time, depending on the type of source required for your assignment. You can also skim through and look at headings and subheadings to get an idea of what the article focuses on. And then look for a thesis or a main claim in the opening paragraph to make sure the article looks promising. And then you can continue looking at, a couple more paragraphs and say, do I think I can use this, or is it kind of going off in a direction that's not going to be helpful for me? In addition to skimming the article, so if I'm doing research, once I've skimmed this over, that's when I'm going to go ahead and read the abstract. So an abstract is usually less than 1 page long, and it's always at the front of the article. It's usually before you even see the article itself. And this super short document is going to give you a very brief summary of the article's main purpose and their findings. So always read that before digging into the full text, because what you don't want to do is, trudge through like a 20-page article and then you realize, well, I didn't find a single quote that I can use here, because that's just a huge waste of time and it's very frustrating. So instead, after I skim it, if I skim something, it might look promising, and then I read the abstract and I'm like, that's not really what I want to talk about. Then I've wasted maybe 5 minutes instead of like a couple hours, right? So if the abstract doesn't seem to relate to your purpose, just move on to the next one, the next article. So once you have found good articles that look promising and you're like, yeah, I want to go ahead and read this whole article and see where I can pull some quotes for my research, then what you need to do is download the article. Um, be aware that you probably will not find it again by searching. I've had this happen so many times with students. They're like, I had the title, I'm searching for the title, and it's not coming up now. I don't know why that is, but just make sure that the first time you see an article, if you're interested in it and you want to read the rest of it, download a PDF. There's usually an option near the article title that says download PDF. Sometimes it's off to the right, sometimes it's off to the left. So just find something that says download PDF or download full text. Click on that to download it and then either print it, email yourself a copy, or add it to your Google Drive. Also, these things will be named really weirdly when you download them, so don't forget to rename it, right? For me, when I'm doing research, I'll name it like English Article 1, right? Or Ocean Pollution Article 1, and then Ocean Pollution Article 2, and so on. That way I know and I can kind of keep track of how many I have when I come back to my research. Many articles only allow access to an abstract, especially if you're on like Google Scholar. So make sure you can access the full text. Again, before you ever search, that's a great time to click that full text only button. This can also be a time when you get stuck, right? So if you need help with this, don't be afraid to click on that button to chat with a librarian, text your group and say, hey, how do I do this? Ask a tutor, ask me, and then remember that links and information on how to reach all of these are available in our syllabus. So that brings us to citing articles. Once you have gone through that process of narrowing down what you want, you've downloaded the article, you've found some information from it, now you need to make sure that you are citing it in MLA. And there are two ways that you're going to need to cite things for our class. The first one is called an in-text citation. This is what you use every time you mention information from this article in your writing. And every time you need to include the author or author's last name or names and the page number where the quote or where the paraphrased information comes from. And then the citation itself goes in parentheses after your quote, but before punctuation. So for example, Fujinami on page 25, or if there's a couple of authors, Fujinami and Smith on page 27, okay? Remember that detailed information about all of this is available in your handbook, a writer's reference. So make sure that you're checking that out as well. Works cited citations are the other kind of citations you're going to be doing. And this is how you cite the whole article. And this is what you include at the end of your essay on your works cited page. Remember that your handbook, the one I just mentioned, includes detailed information on how to cite. There's a whole MLA section, and it will be assigned when we're writing different papers. So make sure that you're looking at that and kind of keep track of those page numbers so you can go and kind of look back as needed. EasyBib.com is also a good place to start for citations. Just make sure to double check that it has done them correctly and complete a manual entry. Okay, don't just use like I can copy and paste a URL. Complete the manual entry because then it will take you through who's the author, what's the page number, what's the title, and so on. Some databases will also do this for you, which is super nice. So look for a Cite This Article button near your article. All right, recap. Research the many things that contribute to the problem that you're looking at. Use the library databases to do your research. And when you're doing that, make sure you sign in, choose the right database for your purpose, use lots of different keywords, and use those advanced search options. Skim articles, then read the abstracts. If they still look promising, that's when you want to download those articles, annotate and read through them, And then whenever you're using any information from an article, you have to cite that in MLA format. And if you're feeling like we just went over a ton of information and I really need some help, keep these links handy. So here's a link to tutoring, a link to help with research, my lecture on summarizing, pages to go to in all of our books, help with writing paragraphs, help with quote sandwiches specifically, and then help with using evidence as well. Okay, so lots of different resources are here for you. Remember to chat with your groups, chat with a tutor, and let me know as well if you get stuck, and we are all here to help each other out.